If you struggle to make your MIDI drums sound massive, punchy, and powerful, this video is for you, because I'm going to show you exactly how to transform drum sounds like this into something more like this. And be sure to stick around to find out how you can get your hands on the samples I use in this video for absolutely free. So real quick before we get into the actual mixing, let's go over the setup so we're all on the same page. I'm using Get Good Drums Modern and Massive for this example, but pretty much any drum program should work. The key is just to make sure that whatever you're using can route the different drums to different outputs. In Modern and Massive, you can set that right here. By default, it's set to stereo, so you'll hear the entire drum kit coming from this channel. But if we switch it to multi-out, now you can send each drum to its own output. Then you just make a track for each drum, set the inputs to plug-in, contact, and select the outputs you set inside Modern and Massive. Then the last thing I like to do is turn off all the shells in the overheads and the room mics so that they're just cymbals. Then you're all set. You can either start working from here, or I prefer to print these tracks down so that I'm now working with audio instead of MIDI. So with that out of the way, we can get to actually working on the drum sounds. The first thing I like to do is by far the most important step, yet it's something a lot of people don't think to do. I slap an instance of trigger on my kick, snare, and tom tracks, and choose my drum sounds. Obviously, if you dig the sounds coming from your drum program, this isn't necessary, but I have yet to find one that I personally like the sound of. I kept buying a bunch that I hoped would sound good, and then one day it dawned on me, I already own a bunch of drum samples I really like, why not just use them? Then I only need the MIDI drummer to have decent cymbal sounds. Maybe everyone else on the planet was already doing this, but man, when I made that realization, it made my life way easier. For this video, I'm using one of my own sample packs, the Bonsai Kit, which is available for free over at bettermixes.com. So be sure to grab them if you dig the sounds we get here. So just by adding those samples, in like 30 seconds, we went from this to this. That's a lot closer to what I'm looking for. So now we can get into the actual mixing. The first thing I like to do is add my drum bus compression. This adds a bit of punch and aggression, and maybe most importantly when using MIDI drums and samples, it kind of helps to tie everything together, making it sound more cohesive. I'm using the Kive Audio Extressor on this track. I've got a 6:1 ratio, slow attack, pretty fast release, and then I've got the mix knob dialed back to about 30%. Let's hear what that's doing. Now with that all set, let's get into the processing on the individual tracks, starting with the kick. Since I chose a sample I like, I'm not too far off from where I want to be. But this is like an easycore, heavy pop punk kind of song, so I think we could use a little bit more click. For that, I'm using Spectre from Waves Factory. It's kind of like an EQ meets saturation. I did a video review on it a while back that you can check out if you want to learn more. I'll link that in the description. But with how I'm using it here, you could absolutely accomplish more or less the same thing with a normal EQ. So it's not like this is some super important key to great drum sounds that you need to go buy, because you don't. I've just been digging it lately. But anyway, like I said, I wanted a little bit more click, so I added a high shelf around 2.5K to help bring that out. Then I felt like it was just a little bit too scooped. So I also added a bit of 800 Hertz to bring out some of that knock in the kick. Moving on to the snare drum, this is a pretty ringy snare, which I like, but it felt like just a little bit too much for this song, especially in the faster sections. It was just taking up a little bit too much space. There are a bunch of ways to deal with that, but I decided to start by reducing the sustain and release settings inside Trigger. I don't want to make it too short and ticky sounding, but bringing the release down to about 3/4 of a second is just helping rein it in a bit. And much like with the kick, I felt like the snare could use a little bit extra mid-range grunt, so I used Spectre again and boosted a bit around 600 Hertz. Then I wanted a little bit more explosiveness to the snare sound, so I reached for a compressor, in this case the Kive Complex compressor. I've got both a fast attack and release so that it's really squashing the snare, adding a lot of length. And then I'm backing the mix knob down to about 50% to let some of that natural transient come back through. That's sounding pretty cool, but the extra compression brought out a few frequencies I wasn't loving in the ring of the snare. So I grabbed an EQ and just notched them out a bit. Then the last thing for the snare is the reverb. I like to use two reverbs on my snare. One, a short gated kind of sound, and the other a more normal, typical reverb sound, like a plate. For the short reverb, I'm using Glow from Wave Alchemy, set to non-Lin 2 setting. The idea of this one is to almost blend in with the snare itself, adding a bit of length and width without sounding especially reverby. For my other reverb, I'm using Liquid Sonic's 7th Heaven set to snare plate B, but really any plate style reverb should do the trick here. Moving on to toms. I'm doing basically nothing. The samples just sound really solid in this track, so I'm just adding a bit of verb to them using another plate setting inside of 7th Heaven to just give them a little bit of space. The first thing I noticed with the overheads was a whole lot of harsh whistly frequencies. I used Soothe to tame them a bit. You could also tackle this with just an EQ, but what's nice with Soothe is that it pulls different harsh frequencies out of the different cymbals throughout the song instead of just static EQ cuts. Next, I grabbed an EQ to shape the sound a bit more. First, there was this one steady whistling frequency ringing out in pretty much all of the cymbals, so a bit of a notch at 2.7K took care of that. Then, even with Soothe working hard in that 3 to 4K region, there's still a lot going on there, so I pulled that down a bit. I thought the cymbals were sounding a little bit muddy at this point, so I made a pretty big cut around 450, as well as a smaller one at 1K to clean that up and give us a glassier kind of cymbal sound. And finally, I slapped on an instance of Saturn doing the Eric Valentine trick. Full video about that up here. Oops, hit the mic. But I'm saturating the mids a fair bit and the highs quite a lot, adding a little bit of extra sheen. Now for the really fun part, rooms. Much like with the overheads, I printed the room mics as just cymbals, but to get that nice roomy sound on our shells as well, I duplicated the kick, snare, and tom tracks, but inside of Trigger, I used the corresponding room samples instead of the close mic samples. Then I sent all of those, plus the cymbal room track, to an aux where I can process them together. And the first thing I'm doing on that rooms aux is adding a compressor. Even though these room samples have compression baked in, I always find that compressing them all together makes them all gel and feel a lot more like a real set of room mics. Then I've got another instance of Saturn, pretty much the exact same thing as on the overheads, saturating the lows a tiny bit, the mids a fair bit, and the top end a lot. Then on the cymbals, I'm once again using Soothe to take out a bit of harshness, followed by an EQ pulling out that same whistly frequency as the overheads, and doing just a tiny bit more shaping. And finally, I wanted a little bit extra brightness on the kick and snare rooms, so I copied over the Spectre settings I was using on the close kick mic, as well as EQing out one weird resonance that was poking out on the snare room. Then just blend the room aux to taste, and we've got a pretty rockin' drum sound. If you dug this video, you might enjoy this playlist, full of more drum mixing tips. And don't forget to grab your free drum samples over at bettermixes.com. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.